Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Gong, the podcast hosting conversations about sales at startups and all the fun stories that come from companies with little cash, no precedence, and lots of guts. My name is Adriel, and I'd led sales at 4 companies, twice as CEO, twice as head of sales, and always with a love for the job and a fondness for fun stories. Currently, I lead sales at self-driving delivery car company Udell. I love startup history, scrappy sales, and stories, and I'm excited to learn them and share them with you. Lately, the thing I've been thinking about is what's it like to sell new technologies? It's what I do in my day-to-day. Self-driving cars are unequivocally going to make a huge difference in the world in the coming future. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and you could see it either in the news or on roads in states around the country. And as I think about my personal sales process, I begin wondering what was it like for Pan Am to tell people that flying in planes is all right and it's going to be the future. How did salespeople at gene sequencing companies in the early 2000s cope with high costs and the still developing technology? I don't know these answers, but that's what I'm looking for, the patterns for these sales that can be found throughout history, and learning from those people is really interesting and really essential. And I don't know most of those answers, and to be honest, I'm still figuring out those questions to ask and looking for those patterns and those stories. Well, that's the reason I'm excited to interview people like today's guests, who are at the forefront of helping companies understand the problems that they're solving and sell their products. On this episode, we've got Ryan Williams, and here's a little bio about Ryan. Ryan Williams is a San Francisco-based executive coach who's deeply passionate about the professional and personal development of high-potential leaders and organizations. As a coach and advisor, Jay Ryan is trusted by founders and CEOs backed by the world's top venture funds, U.S. Navy SEALs, and former Top Gun fighter pilots, as well as aspiring executives. Before launching his coaching and facilitation practice, Jay Ryan spent over 10 years helping to build some of the fastest growing companies backed by Silicon Valley-based VC firms, and has been instrumental for multiple companies as they grew from $0 to $100 million in revenue, including direct leadership, which launched a $58 million sales team and created a 2-year training curriculum for 350 employees, and sales coaching for the CEO of InVision App, which has gone on to close 95% of the Fortune 500. As keynote speaker, Jay Ryan's talks have taken him to 13 countries, and he's been hosted at universities like University of Chicago and Berkeley Haas, and all these fantastic places around the world. We talk about a lot here with Ryan, ranging from how to price a product, how to fight through competition when Google joins your industry, and how to sell a VR headset to displace cadavers in hospitals. That's right, we go all over the place. I hope you enjoy, and don't get too squeamish during my episode with Ryan Williams. All right, Ryan, welcome to The Gong.
Thank you.
We are going to have a great time today. Me and my Argyle, you and your checkered shirts. Here's where I want to start. So I want to hear the story of what happened when you first found out that the company you're working for, Adderall, which at the time was doing less than $500,000 a year in sales, pretty small company, learned that Google had released a competing product. Tell me the story of learning about that.
Well, there's 2 layers. So for me, the real challenge was I had just moved to San Francisco not very long before that. I had just moved in with this girlfriend of mine, and so when I heard that Google Remarketing had been released, I went home and told her the bad news that I wasn't going to make rent, the company was probably going to fail, and I was going to move home and live with my parents. And
was she invited to live with your parents?
She wasn't.
No.
Well, I don't think she was that interested.
Okay.
She's really enjoyed being in San Francisco, and my parents had just moved to Texas, and so I was going to go live with them. Nobody really wants to move to Dallas. Like, who are you kidding, right? It's too hot there and not that fun. But her response was, "Do you think that you'll learn from this?" And I've taken that as a really important question, right? So that's been an anchor question for me, is like, what will I learn regardless of, how fast will we grow and how much money we'll make and what we'll do. The founders at Adderall, they came out and said, look, Google's released the same product. It's pretty similar. It's going to educate the market. Everything's fine. Just go back to your desk and keep working. And so at that point, I was just a few weeks in, and I was reaching out to potential advertisers who had e-commerce stores, mostly those who had attended a conference or we knew, were similar to the handful of customers we did have. About 2-3 weeks after that announcement, we started seeing customers show up and say, hey, we've been using Google remarketing for a few weeks now. It's working. We want to see what else is like it. And so they were right. I don't know if they knew they were going to be right, and I'd love to ask them. I should. But it started to educate the market, and it started to tell people, like, hey, there's this thing. It's called ad retargeting. People know about it now because it's tied to all the behavioral advertising that's had a bad press the last few years. But in 2011, this was something that people just didn't do. Basically the ability to show an ad to somebody after they leave a website would have conversion rates 3 to 10 times higher than other advertising. So the ROI was just through the roof, and our customers really liked that. But it did give quite a bit of heartburn at the beginning.
How different was your conversation with one of your clients before Google announced it? What did that look like? What did you emphasize? Yeah. And then in the 3 to 4 months after Google released their product, what changed in the way you spoke with customers?
That's a great question, because we had, for the first year that I was there, we were selling this very highly educational pitch. This is what retargeting is. This is what it does. We would say things very specific, like, do you know how if you see an ad after you leave a website, that's what we do. Would you like to be able to reach customers when they read the news after they decided they didn't buy your shoes? Those types of questions. And so after people started hearing about Google's remarketing product and started seeing it more in the wild, and that started to catch up, the pitch changed slightly to, you're familiar with this, do you know about retargeting, do you know about remarketing? And when customers would recognize that, then it would be very, it was very straightforward. Here's what you can try, and it was about, trying one or two things at the same time to see what worked best. And we would win bake-offs for, the first few years regularly because we had more inventory than some of the other partners that were in the same space. And having more inventory in the ad game means you can bid and be more efficient. So that part was good, but those conversations did change. They changed because the market was being educated. They were, the founders were right.
So when we try to expand that same learning to other companies, and now you're coaching and working with lots of different startups, or you have over the last few years, the educational part of a new industry is something I really want to understand, because when a new company launches something in a new industry, when they need to teach people about how to use something for the first time, when you're a virtual reality headset maker selling into doctor's office or medical schools for training on surgery, before you even begin to talk about pricing or features or any implementation, you're talking about, well, this is why, and this is how it works, and this is the state of the technology. How should either whoever's doing the sales, either the founder or the sales people at startups in new industries, think about educating their market?
Yeah, that's great, because I think most of us, when we start to sell something new, we say, oh, what does that thing do? And let me sell the features. Right, this is how fast it goes, or this is the what it shows you, or what it will do, or and sometimes we take features into cost and we couple, like, this is what it's worth because. Now, when I think about this scenario of a new market, a new customer, it's understanding where the customer's at today. All right, so in your question about a VR headset for surgery, it's having that conversation to say, what are the current challenges, where you're at today. What are you doing? What would you like to be able to do, right? Which is where I think that early stage sales is very, very close to market development, and what the product-oriented founders have been doing most likely is, do people want this? What would they use it for? And using some of those same questions. So if especially a founder who's selling, I would say get them to as close to using the kind of product mindset that they're probably using to develop product, right? Like, how would you use this? What are you expecting to see? Why would you use this? What do you need? Those types of questions can lead to the right conversation where you can start to educate and say, oh yeah, well, the thing that you're talking about is something that we do, or is something we're building for in the future, or is something we're thinking about. And that, I think, will tee up the right type of atmosphere so that you can, start to convert business from that.
Yeah, I would love if you could take that into an example of how to then convert that into the sales process. The educating the marketer, educating the client is obviously a really important early part of the process, and you could take that with any new technology, possibly with any new company, even because you got to educate them about your specific way of doing things. But really, it comes in sort of generational waves. Retargeting was never a thing. Let's teach about retargeting. Self-driving cars were never a thing. Let's teach about self-driving cars. Would love to hear any sort of anecdote or story of when you've taken that, or you worked with a company to take that period of time. You said, well, this is how you convert from that stage into, well, let's talk about the sale.
Yeah.
Because I find, and many people probably find, a salesperson, hey, we got Sally on the phone from this giant Fortune 100. She's interested. We're learning. She's interested. We're learning. Yeah. 4 calls in. We're talking about the market. It's still interesting. She's still really interested. And then it's been 8 months. You haven't even talked about what it's like to close. How do you recognize in a customer that they are educated enough?
Yeah.
And how do you move that into actually closing and getting something going on something pretty nascent?
Yeah, I would say that the fastest hack here is to understand what else that customer buys. Right. So here's an example, right? So if I'm with your VR headset example, so if I'm talking to somebody who's the director of training at a surgery lab, I reach out to them and say, what other tools do you use? I start to learn about it, and I realize they have tools, and how have they purchased those tools? What are they spending on those tools? You walk into a surgery clinic, you see if they've got a bunch of tables that are furnished by Stryker. How did those tables get there? And if you can learn about that, then you can match that buying process. Did they buy the equipment? Was the equipment donated? If it's donated, then perhaps you need to sell a partnership into somebody who's donating to that surgery center, right? Like one of the big, medical device companies that might want to do a co-branding and put your logo or their logo on your device. Another example is, when, maybe your audience might relate to this, but think about sales tools, right? If I talk to somebody who's at a sales team of 10 people, and they use Salesforce, they also use some enterprise email solutions like a Marketo or a Loqua, the chance that they've spent around $100,000 to support that team is very high. Whereas another early stage company, you call and you say, hey, what are you guys using? And they say, oh, we use HubSpot, we use HubSpot CRM and HubSpot email. That means they're probably not spending much more than $2,000 or $3,000 to support the same 10-person team. Now, I'm not arguing which one's right or wrong on sales tools. What I'm saying is you just learned about someone's qualified buying process. If they've spent $100,000 to support a team of 10, you know how they've procured it. You can say, who brought Salesforce in the organization? Who's your Salesforce admin? Right? There are tools like that for every business. Software is in the world. And so every business and every vertical has a bunch of software tools. And when you can learn about who sponsored that, who bought that, why they buy it, what their budget authority is, like how they think about it. And a lot of times with product founders, the technical product folks who are building tools, what they kind of fail to recognize when they put their sales hat on is that they might be a buyer in a different world. Right? Like you may have been the person who bought this tool at your last company. That's why you started the company. How did you buy it? What else did you buy? When I give talks to, when I gave a talk a couple weeks ago called Sales Lives at 500 Startups, and I asked people to raise their hand if they've ever made a purchase on behalf of a corporation. 3 hands went up. The guy that had bought something for a bank said, this is how I bought when I was at the bank. I ran IT. This is what I did. This is what my purchase approval was. That is great intel to match. And so it's not really about the education is done, let's flip the switch and now let's sell. But let's instead educate in the same path that customer is used to. Because you can disrupt what they're going to use, or you can disrupt the way they buy it. You can't disrupt both at the same time.
One of the things that happens in this process is as the education continues, as the relationship builds, is eventually pricing comes into the mix. And oftentimes these brand new technologies that people haven't seen before that come in generational waves, they go one of two ways. Either they are priced 10 times lower than anything anyone's ever seen before. I can't believe I ever paid these kinds of prices. Yeah. All of a sudden you're paying pennies on the dollar because it's something technology enabled. Many times that is maybe true, but maybe it's also supported by venture capital dollars. Maybe that's not the actual reality. And even to bring you this vision of lower cost, the actual product itself is much more expensive. We could take our magical VR for surgery thing, where we say right now you're doing surgeries on cadavers, keeping cadavers cold, and proper is really, really expensive. Now with VR you can do this considerably cheaper. Think about what you can save.
Now, while that's true, supporting the actual VR system, the headsets are expensive and there's all these challenges with it, and creating the right environment for it is a lot more expensive today, but you'll say this cost will lower over time. So, assuming that to be true, how do you advise companies and salespeople to think about the pricing of their brand new technologies? Do they, A, undercut at all costs and just try to get into the market maybe for the best customers? Do they, B, say, you know what, there's this option today, we're going to price out exactly that option, make their buying opportunity easy? Or do you say, C, price that as close to what it costs you to run the service as possible, see how high you can get, and see which customers are willing to pay that, because those are the customers that are going to stick through you for the longest period of time, customers that need it the most, customers that will invest the most in you and give you the most feedback. I've heard good things about all three of those options, and maybe there's a fourth and a fifth one I'm thinking about, but how do you think about pricing in the earliest stages of new technologies?
I think pricing is tough. I think the first piece is I would suggest that founders, again, know the customer, know what they're buying, right? Think about the example I gave with Salesforce versus HubSpot. If you know how much someone's already investing, then you actually know what the risk is and what they're, maybe even know why they're investing, right? The second piece is understand what the cost of the problem is, right? So if, the cadaver story that you just told, which is now freaking me out because I'm thinking too hard about it, it reminds me of one of the weirdest sales pitches I ever had, which we'll get to maybe in a little bit. But how much does a cadaver cost? How much does a professor cost over that cadaver? Let's do all that math and then say, and you also said it costs to keep them cold. I hadn't even thought of that. That's also grossing me out. And so we add that. Right?
I don't know where this comes from. I never worked in the industry. I'm just obsessed now with cadavers.
You're going to love this story in a minute. But do that math, and let's say you come up with, to educate 5 students in a workshop, it's, $100,000 or whatever the number is. Now, when you know that that's a $100,000 problem and you start to figure out, hey, this is how often they do it, I mean, the kind of standard rule of thumb is, can you be 10x better than what they're currently doing? That's how we think about, is the product going to be good enough? Think about that in terms of cost, right? I'm not saying go in at 1/10 of the price, but go in with that improvement kind of pre-calculated. What do you think the ROI will be? Another way to ask, the third option is to ask yourself the question of, what would you buy if you were in that role, right? So if you were let's say you're building a security product, because it's a little less grotesque, right? If you're building a cybersecurity product and you have the technical chops to go be director of cybersecurity at, whatever firm, what would you buy? How would you buy it? How much would you spend on this? How big of a problem do you think it is? In banking, it costs a lot of money if you get hacked. More banking and healthcare, insurance, for sure, costs you a lot of money to get hacked. But small startups, you get hacked, you're not losing a bunch of data. That's going to cost them less. And so if you've got an SMB cyber product, you're probably not going to be able to charge that much for it because it's not a huge problem. Here's a quick shortcut to get to that same number of how much the problem is to figure out how many people are dedicated to solving that problem. So if you've got drones that sweep a gym floor, go figure out that, that high school, how many custodians they're employing. Go look for active job postings or check on Glassdoor. All right, this school district has 20 custodians. They've got 20 schools. All right, so it's probably 1 custodian each. What do they make? Check on Glassdoor. Maybe look at a listing. See what that hourly is and do the math and say, okay, this, cleaning drone is worth X, in terms of an employee cost, right? Maybe it also makes it even cleaner, and that's better to meet a particular standard. Now you can start to do the math.
Well, the question stands, is there ever value to pricing considerably higher, or is it a strategy worth even, how do you think about the strategy of pricing higher than what the current solution is, with the vision of then lowering the cost much later? Because it's easy, if you have the backing, if you have the venture capital backing, it's easy to say undercut or match or do whatever, our technology is better, over time it'll decrease. The pricing higher one is one I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because I've heard it both ways, where on the one hand, don't bother with pricing higher, you're fighting an uphill battle, don't do it. And on the other is, if it costs you at the moment 2x to build whatever drones that sweep floors, to be less grotesque than it does janitors, well, you're going to be losing a heck of a lot of money unless you're charging at least close to what it costs you.
Yeah, so I think that pricing should be efficient. because there's no guarantee that you get the next round, right? Most of the startups I work with are outside of Silicon Valley, where they're not guaranteed that Series A or Series B, and even the companies that are here are not often guaranteed that. And so having something that, you know, is priced pretty close to what the market thinks is fair, as well as kind of, yeah, sure, R&D wise, the first one's going to cost you a lot more than the second or third, but pricing it to a level of efficiency, I think, is probably a good idea overall.
What does that mean?
If it's going to cost you $100 to make, don't sell it for 50 just because you want to undercut. You know, don't subsidize unless you really have to, right? I think there are a lot of big companies that are subsidized by VC dollars, and that doesn't actually tell you about the experiment. The thing that I would say about just the pricing thing is, you know, yeah, you're right. If you price it really high, the main byproduct is that's going to encourage the buyer to be more committed, theoretically, right? They may not all, you know, you may lose some deals, but we also won't know, did you lose the deal because of the price? Did you lose the deal because of the product? Did you lose the deal because of the relationship? And early stage founders are often asking, is it me or is it the product? Did I do something wrong when I'm selling, or is the product not what they want? How would you take one of those pieces out of the equation, right? How do you make sure that if the process matches the way they buy other things, you can go ahead and say it's not going to be the process. Let's find out if the tool is really valuable, and then figure out the price from there. Figure out if it's something that they actually want at that price, or match the price of a current competitor, and then practice on the process and test that out. I know it's a non-answer still, but you know, I don't think that it's as easy as just saying, hey, go double it. You know, some of the sales advice out there is once you get it right, and this is one that I hear from Jason Limkin occasionally, right? He says, once you get it right, double the price, and then double it again and see, you know, and test it to that point where it flatlines. That only works if you're controlling all the other variables of your experiment. If you're not controlling for the other variables, you're not going to know what changed. When you have a tool where, well, in most cases, let's take the janitor thing again, right? So we're going to go and we're going to say, you know, our drone will clean the high school much faster than our human will. Safer, whatever, you know, we solve for all that stuff. If a school district has 100 schools and we put a drone in there to go clean it, clean one school, that's not going to move the needle at all. And so the other question on pricing is asking for enough of a rollout that actually tells a story internally in that company, right? When we were at AdRoll and we're selling advertising, we'd have a lot of people say, this makes sense, let's try a $25 test, because that was the lowest budget you could buy. Well, when Microsoft tried to do that, I was like, this is not going to move the needle at all. And then instead they said, all right, well, let's dedicate a certain amount of our monthly budget for a certain amount of time, so then we can actually see something that actually, you know, kind of will change that number. And in that case, they did come back, and we did have a really successful campaign that was a lot more than $25, because then they had enough data they could actually evaluate if it was working.
Is there ever a time where pricing too low can sort of bite you in the butt? For example, this Microsoft thing, if you're talking to somebody at Microsoft and you say, let's run a $25 test, that's probably not worth the time it takes the individual to sign the piece of paper to agree to it.
Not at all.
Right?
It's not worth it.
So when is pricing too low? What are the risks of pricing too low?
Well, that's the biggest risk, right, is it's not worth their time, not worth their energy. You know, at a big company, you know, that person needs it to be a big enough project that moves the needle for their... Remember, you're selling to somebody who's going to go to a staff meeting and tell people what they're doing. If that's the case, then, you know, you can't expect them to go into a meeting and say, I just bought this thing, it was $25, and we got 3 extra sales because of it.
They're going to get booed out of the meeting and demoted.
Absolutely. But if you got 3 extra sales into a company that does an average order value of, you know, $10 million, you just had a $30 million campaign come through, right? That is significant. Kind of, you know, I guess depends on the size of the company, but most companies, that would be a really significant number that people would want to talk about.
Yeah.
So could you price too low? Absolutely. You want to be in a place where your pricing is aligned, so it's not the thing that people are saying yes or no to because of. Because if somebody's deciding yes or no, if they're price sensitive and they're deciding yes or no on this product because of what it costs, then you're backed in a corner where you really only have one tool, which is the discount, right? If instead they're making that decision based on value, which is, you know, ratio of what the price is to what it's actually going to do for them, that gives you a little more leeway, right? Because then you can say, if we double the value by having two of these things, two of these robots or two of these headsets or something like that, does that change the efficiency at all? And when it does, you start to get to this tipping point where people go, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. You'd be surprised at how many people are not making this decision based on price, though, especially B2B sales, bigger companies. The decision's not usually about how much does it cost. That's usually the qualifying question because it's the one thing buyers know to ask right away because their boss is going to ask them. But instead, if you can get out of that and have a different conversation, you'll learn a lot more quicker than just getting yourself eliminated based on price.
A lot of the last bit of the conversation here has been about thinking about an approach to something, thinking about the relationship you're building with something, thinking about in many ways the values you have in your sales structure, your sales style. Right now with what you do, you talk a lot about values and you help a lot of leaders and companies think about their values.
Yeah.
How do early stage companies, especially early stage sales organizations, think about the values they want to embed in the people doing their sales? And it was also, let's learn how that changes as you work with larger and larger companies, now some public companies. How do those maybe not, well, A, how do the values change, but B, how does perhaps that implementation of or communication of those values change from the largest companies to the smallest companies?
Yeah. Well, let's start first with the value of trust, right? We want to be in a place where our customers trust us. And that's also a lot of the reason why early stage founders get worried about that first sales hire, because they're worried that their customer won't trust a salesperson to sell it. Instead, it needs to be someone technical who knows it. We can test for the, does somebody trust based on, there's a great book called The Trusted Advisor by David Meister, and he talks about this trust equation. He says trust is equal to, and it's a formula of credibility, reliability, and intimacy over self-orientation, right? So that's kind of a tough, fraction without kind of breaking down a little bit, but just think about if you're going to define how much you trust somebody by whether or not they're credible, reliable, and whether or not there's some level of business intimacy there, they're, have disclosed why they're doing this, why they're in sales, why they built the product, maybe it's something about the company history, and then the kind of the bottom number there is the self-orientation, right? Are they doing this out of selfishness? Is it just for them, just for a commission, just so that they can be successful? Or are they actually thinking about changing an industry or making somebody better or making you better because they got into it because they care, right? Like, I'm not a coach for the money. I'm an executive coach because I think this is the best way to see the world that I envision, right? So when you think about that, you think about, okay, now we're aligning to, can I trust my people, right? That's value one, is trustworthiness. Often when we talk about sales, we talk about people's aversion to sales. A way to encourage the people around you to align with the values of the founder and values of the company often can be set by what questions are asked. What questions are you asking in the interview? What questions are you asking in the team meeting? That reveals, kind of what values you have or what incentives you want to put into place. A quick example would be, if you're testing whether or not the market is interested, there's an argument to be made for not testing based on who buys what. Right? You can't say the market is interested, yes or no, by whether or not they bought the headsets for our Cadaver lab. Whether or not they return the call, it will tell you whether or not there's an interest in new technology in this space. Whether or not they can buy, maybe academic cycles, they're on a year or 2 year academic cycle to go buy something, right? So if you want to test that, it's really, did they write you back? Are they interested? Are the right people involved in this conversation? Are you talking to deans or are you talking to tech guys who think VR is cool? That can tell you whether or not they're interested, all right? So here's how we back that into values, right? So as a leader or a CEO or a sales leader, when you go into the team and you say, hey, I want to know how many headsets we sold, that's going to be one number that looks at the whole process. But instead you say, how many people got back to us for that first meeting? Now you're showing that what you're interested in is having conversations. What you're supporting is having conversations, as opposed to saying, I just care about how much money we're making, how many devices were sold.
Are conversations in some ways a false positive? In the sense that, well, you could have a lot of conversations, never make the close, and the company's out of business anyway, even though there's lots of nice conversations.
Well, yeah, if you're, could it be a false positive? It's a false positive if you're talking about whether or not someone wants to buy your stuff. Mm-hmm. If you're testing whether or not something's interested about tech in that marketplace, right? We're going back to sales is just customer development, right? A point that we discussed before. So I feel like that gets us pretty close to being able to communicate the values of the founder by what you ask about, right? Another way to do it is to say, okay, I'm only going to ask, what the value per seat is. Selling at $5 a seat, selling $6 a seat. If that's the metric that I'm looking at every week for my sales report as opposed to the total dollar amount, right? Maybe my values say that I really want people using the product that we're selling, not just closing it, right? I care about adoption. Well, then let's measure adoption and then talk about it internally, right? Values aren't just, are you trustworthy? Are you happy at work? Do we have a good ball pit to play in, right? It's actually, can be communicated by what questions the leadership team asks.
Do you find that when you work with leadership team, say even experienced ones, not those doing this for the first time, they've codified this at all on their own in advance of conversations with you, or is it very nebulous oftentimes, and that's one of the challenges?
The highest performing leaders that I meet and work with are the ones that already can kind of discuss their value system. They know why it's there. I started my career in education, and we couldn't actually go teach in a classroom before we wrote out our philosophy of education. The funny thing is, teachers always teach the way they're taught. So if you come out of a school that teaches a certain way or with a particular pedagogy, you're likely going to do that as a teacher. The same is likely true for what sales organization you come up in, right? There's a lot of people who talk, smack about, people that started at Yelp or started at Oracle or started wherever. And I'm not going to go into the debate about, what's the best sales training or what's the best background. But if you're in the environment where some of those habits or things happen, you're likely going to use them, which is a great thing. So sales reps that come up in an environment that's a high velocity sales organization, like a Yelp, where there's a lot of reps calling for a $500 to $1,000 ad buy, and I don't know what their current pricing is, then they're going to be conditioned around some of the tools that happen to keep sales moving that fast, closing 10, 20, 30 deals a week to get that number, right? Whereas when you think about, later stage, right? Later stage companies, or not necessarily later stage, but higher ACV companies rather, you want to make sure that you're doing certain things that support a bigger deal as opposed to a transactional sale, right? So when I talk to leaders about what their value systems are, some of them are very tactical of hey, these are the things that I like about the work we do. And sometimes it gets into some of this is the way I feel, this is what I want to, I really value transparency on the team. I talked to somebody the other day that their company really values transparency. He knew why, and he also knew where it was aspirational. He said, hey, well, this is what we're doing, and this is the part that we know we're not doing well. We want to be more transparent in this regard, right? That's a pretty advanced kind of self-awareness. Having self-awareness as a leader is one thing. Having a self-awareness that's organizationally, where you all know, this is what we're interested in, this is why. I think that's pretty powerful.
Do you have a series of, as you do this coaching and you're trying to bring leaders to be their best, do you have a series of maybe go-to questions that you find yourself asking each and every time?
When I'm talking to a leader about what their value system is, I don't necessarily have go-to questions. I do use a tool called the Leadership Inventory, where I'll sit down with a leader and help them kind of evaluate how they think they're doing and how their team thinks they're doing, as well as how the employees on that team think they're doing. That can often lead to a really powerful kind of self-awareness that you can't get without doing that kind of 360-degree review and start thinking about yourself. That I find is really helpful. In terms of evaluating the values like a leader might when they're hiring, I would say, think about a time when you feel like you've been pushed to your edge and you had to make a moral decision about work. For me, that's whether or not you lie to a customer about a refund, right? When you have to go and tell somebody, look, we took your money and we didn't deliver that thing that we said we were going to. So that's why my favorite interview question for a sales rep is, tell me about a time you gave a customer bad news. The answer to that will reveal whether or not this person and I agree on what to do in that case. There are a lot of people who think that it's totally respectable to say, all right, I'm going to hold my breath and hope they don't notice. Other people that want to call and be direct. Some want to kind of spin that and say, yeah, we didn't really exactly do what you said we're going to do, but we did kind of what we said we're doing. I worked for somebody who, this was one of the hardest jobs I had in San Francisco. He was booking a wedding venue, and he wouldn't sign his copy of the contract. And so the bride would sign off, and then there'd always be excuses of why he didn't send his side of the executed contract, because he wanted to have the ability to get out of it later. Right? Now, I don't know how I test that as an employee, right? There's maybe some other questions that I would ask that might have led me to find out about that. But that's somebody who, if they're going to test, does somebody line up their values, they're probably looking for somebody who's always going to do what's right for the organization. Other people may say do what's right for the customer no matter what. It just kind of depends on where you're at and what you want your organization to be.
Well, on that note, I want to take a quick pivot and in our last few minutes here ask you some rapid fire questions. I will ask them quickly. You can answer them as slowly or as quickly as you would like. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. You teased it, but what is your weirdest sales story?
A weirdest sales story is actually selling into a surgery center that had a bunch of cadavers. And it was weird in two ways. One, the prospect said, make sure you bring a jacket. And I thought that was strange. And he said, our office is near some coolers, so make sure you bring a jacket. And it was it was the University of California, San Francisco's like surgery centers at San Francisco General. And that's where they teach orthopedic surgery, like knee replacements, hip replacements, stuff like that. So we get to this meeting, and I'm usually a pretty queasy person when it comes to like medical stuff. I grew up in a family that didn't really do a lot of going to the doctor. So this is like, but I needed the cash, right? This was like we were very heavily incentivized in the sales org. I was selling website development, and so I went there with my sales engineer, this guy James. And the favorite moment of that whole thing is as I'm asking discovery questions to find out what type of teaching they do. James is leaning up against this really beautiful, like, if you've ever been in a surgery center, they've got these beautiful, like, stainless steel tables that would make awesome, like, really smooth desks. And so James is leaning up against one, and she goes, well, just yesterday we had 10 heads here for a Botox demonstration. And I saw him almost lose his lunch. It grossed him out so much. It was awesome. It was such a funny thing. Then, you think about it too hard, and you think, wow, you donate your body to science, you end up, getting a Botox test, on this, years later, and some back room.
There's worse things that the scientific community could have done to my body.
Probably. So, that was probably one of the weirdest discovery meetings I ever had.
Very cool. What is any sales or startup book that have been particularly helpful to you? You mentioned Trusted Advisor.
I like Trusted Advisor. That's really written more around like how to create like professional services relationships for like lawyers and accountants and things like that, because that's what his research came out of. So if you're in a really complicated sale, becoming that trusted advisor, I think makes a lot of sense. If you're at a high velocity sales organization, read that book and say, how can I do this as fast as possible? Because I might only have a 10-minute phone call to kind of create that trust. In general, I think sales books are about 50 to 60% wrong, because founders will read them and think about this as an absolute value for their organization. Your job as a founder, early stage sales employee, is to decide what fits for your organization. So read them all and pick and choose what works for you, right? If I had to point to a favorite, for the super early stage, there's a lot of lessons from Mark Roberts' book, Sales Acceleration Formula, around hiring, around specifically tracking interview responses, and then tracking that to a 3-month employee review. There's a whole chapter on kind of hiring and employees, and I think that might be universal to see kind of what worked for the interview and how they do 9 months in, or 3 months in, 9 months in. I think that makes a lot of sense.
All right. What is the sale you are most proud of landing?
I don't know how long the statute of limitations I'm talking about this one is, but I think that there's a critical point for every person who's done sales where they have learned that sales isn't luck. People who aren't sellers, they have not learned that, and they think everything is just about luck and holding your breath. And even people who've been in sales for many years haven't overcome that feeling. And so for me, it was mid-November of 2011, and the sale was to Fandango. It was an advertising deal, and it was the first time that I actually saw in action, 3 months earlier translate into exactly the way the deal closed. Now, it wasn't the best client to have had, and that's a whole nother story for a beer, but it was the first time I realized sales wasn't luck. And it closed like clockwork. I remember specifically where I was because my first daughter, Emma, was born during that sales process. And so I had to leave work for paternity leave and to go and do our thing. But I knew that everything was basically on a conveyor belt to close and get set up and run smoothly and correctly. And so that was one that I'm particularly proud of.
Very cool. What is one of your biggest failures that has later led to success? You mentioned before you had a big leadership fail.
My leadership fail is actually another kind of early stage story where things started to go really well, and with building out an SDR team, we decided to experiment with hiring an outsourced team. I don't know if you used outsourced sales before in your career, but we went and we had two projects, and we hired 5-person teams for each one. One was an inside sales team that we wanted to build, and they were empowered to kind of close deals. And the team that I had was a outsourced sales development team where these 5 people were going to set appointments, and they would get handed off. I thought the point of having an outsourced team was so you didn't have to know them, right? So I didn't want to actually know their names. I thought it was like naming the lobsters in the tank where you couldn't get rid of them and fire them. At this point in my management career, I had not hired or fired very much at all. And so to have 5 new people on the team, I just said, hey, you know what? They're going to work or not work. The whole point of outsourcing is just to be able to get rid of them if they don't fit. Fail, right? Because I'll tell you exactly what happened. The other manager who went and spent time with his outsourced team, trained them, gave them T-shirts, put pennants on the wall, set up sales training programs and spiffs and things like that. That team adopted very quickly and has continued to grow. That grew to about 100 people within a year, whereas my team of 5, that lasted maybe 6 weeks before we spun it down. Could I have gotten it to work? Yes, but the culture wasn't there, the efficiency wasn't there, the communication wasn't there, the management group there was like, hey, how come you're not spending more time making sure things are lined up to be successful? Because I just said, hey, you're either going to perform or not perform, we're going to cut you loose. And that, looking back, is the kind of the worst way to set up a sales team. And I know there are a lot of founders who want to do that even with an inside team that's working for them. Hey, we're going to try this out for a little bit. And I think people know when they're experimented on. I do. I think that they know that, and they know what your commitment is to them. If your commitment is, let's make this work because the organization is going to need sales, and you're going to have a job regardless because we're going to make it work, then there are ways that you incentivize that are very different than black or white. It either works or doesn't. It either works or we fire you. And I wish I hadn't had that mindset, but I learned a lot from it.
All right. Well, I got 2 final questions for you, Ryan. The first is something I wish somebody had asked me one day.
Yeah.
You have 30 seconds to sell me this pen.
Oh, you wish somebody asked you to
I always wanted this interview question. You're down to 28 seconds, Ryan. Sell me this pen.
Oh, I think I would start with asking you about your notes. So tell me, what notes have you been writing over there? You've got 5 or 6 things written down.
I sort of summaries of some of the things that I've really enjoyed talking about. Pricing too low, risks of such a thing, when to price high.
And what are you going to use those notes for?
I'm going to create a summary of our conversation and eventually put this into a book format.
Are podcasts or books successful without having those summaries?
I don't think they would be.
Okay, so what kind of if that's valuable to you, would you give me $1 for that? Would you give me $1 for this pen?
It depends on how much money I make off my advertising here. Maybe some ad roll experience.
Maybe that's maybe the worst pen sale possible, but it really just comes down to values and what someone's problem they're trying to solve is, right? You're not going to be successful without those notes. I know that, and that's what I would probably set up for you on that.
Awesome. Ryan, this has been a ton of fun. Please tell all of us, where can people find some of the stuff you're writing about, speaking about? Yeah. Where can they learn more about you?
So I write a lot, or I link to a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow, or if we've met before, send me a request. It's just J. Ryan Williams, so linkedin.in/J. Ryan Williams. And then I have a lot of resources for early stage sales at salescollider.com, which was the kind of my advisory portfolio that I had set up a few years ago. Many of those workshops, couple interviews that are on there that are really, I think, pretty helpful. So you go to salescollider.com/blog. You can hear from some of the experts I've met, some of the interviews I've done. as well as some talks.
Awesome. Ryan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
This was
it.
great.
Well, there you have it. Ryan Williams, ladies and gentlemen. Competition from the big players could be a blessing. There are clever ways to learn about what persuades your customers to buy. And pricing? Well, there's no right answer there, but pricing high might be better than pricing low. If you like the podcast, leave us a review. If you didn't, tweet me at alubarski2 and we'll make it all better. Thanks, and happy selling.